MMA is a young sport. It's not even 3 decades old yet. 30 years may sound like a lot, but when compared to combat sports like boxing or wrestling, which have been around for centuries or even millennia, it's still in its infancy. During the early days of the UFC, it would be wrong to call what was going on mixed martial arts. After all, the whole purpose was to pit fighters of different disciplines against one another to see which would come out on top. And of course, put on a few freak show fights. You had boxers, wrestlers, kickboxers, but no true MMA fighters. Until Royce Gracie showed the rest of the martial arts world what jiu-jitsu could do, no one really knew what it was. It would be years before fighters you could call mixed martial artists appeared on the scene who sported a well-rounded game. Even in modern MMA, it's not uncommon to see fighters who excel in one aspect of MMA while lacking in another. Sometimes that lacking area is their downfall, and sometimes their excellence in another will make up for it. But every fighter who enters a cage is a true mixed martial artist. Mixed martial arts has evolved greatly in a relatively short amount of time. From the early years to modern day, the sport is nearly unrecognizable. Even now, we see the sport evolve in front of us with new techniques making waves in the sport, like the low calf kick or the Dagestani handcuff. It would be foolish to think that even the champions of the first handful UFC events could contend with the fighters of today. But at what point in MMA history did the discrepancy in skill begin to level up? And are the legends of old who pioneered the sport truly as good as we remember? Or are they part of the bygone era that just doesn't compare to the modern day fighter? Let's look at some examples. Chuck Liddell, Anderson Silva, Glover Teixeira, Quinton Jackson, and Randy Couture. What do all these fighters have in common? For one, they're all legends and pioneers of the sport. And they also made their MMA debuts within a roughly 2-year span of each other, from 97 to 99, but led different careers that lasted different lengths. If you think of Couture and Liddell, it feels like it's been ages since they fought in the octagon. Mike Goldberg was still around, the Reebok deal didn't exist, and UFC promos were set to heavy metal music. It's been about 10 years since either of them has fought in the UFC, and it's safe to say the sport has evolved greatly since then. If you pluck Couture or Liddell out of 2005 and threw them into the modern light heavy or heavyweight rankings, how would they do? For those of you who are newer fans of the sport and didn't follow them during their prime, the Natural and the Iceman were no joke. Chuck Liddell was an early UFC star with 10 UFC knockouts and the record for the longest knockout streak at 7. The knee-jerk conclusion would be simply, no, they wouldn't be able to hold up to today's talent. But looking at some of the other fighters mentioned above might challenge that. Take Glover Teixeira and Mirko Cro Cop for example. Cro Cop debuted soon after Liddell and Couture, but lasted in the sport far longer, retiring just in 2019 on a 10-fight win streak. Not to mention Teixeira picked up a crazy second win at the time of this video on a 5-fight win streak in the top ranks of the light heavyweight division at 41 years old. The difference between long-lasting fighters Teixeira and Cro Cop and not so long-lasting ones like Liddell and Couture isn't a difference in skill. Father Time treats fighters differently, and each fighter took different amounts of damage, not to mention each started their careers at different ages. Randy Couture is the oldest UFC champion ever holding a title at 45 years old, while Teixeira was only 29 at the time. If we take out the aging and damage and strictly compare the skill of these old legends in their prime to the fighters of today, then it might not be so clear-cut. In the mid-2000s, we saw what could be argued the first wave of true mixed martial artists begin to appear on the scene. Not just brawlers and wrestlers who swung wildly. With more fighters becoming proficient in both striking and grappling, it became necessary to have a strong wrestling or grappling base to be truly successful in the sport. All the fighters mentioned in this video, Liddell, Silva, Teixeira, Couture, and others, have all exceptional wrestling or jiu-jitsu skills which allowed them to strike comfortably and effectively without much worry. This trend has stayed strong ever since, with modern day greats following a similar trend. GSP, John Jones, Stipe Miocic, Henry Cejudo, Amanda Nunes, Demetrius Johnson, Daniel Cormier, the list could go on and on, but all have one thing in common, a superb ground game. Given that logic, if these old legends who fit with this criteria were taken from their prime and put in today's MMA scene, they should fare pretty well. After all, think of some of the potential matchups and they don't sound that crazy at all. Prime 2009 Anderson Silva vs Israel Adesanya, or 2005 Fedor Emelianenko vs Stipe Miocic. Or what about 2008 Liddell vs Jan Blachowicz, or 2010 GSP vs Kamaru Usman? If you're familiar with these old fighters and their resumes, these matchups probably don't sound too crazy, and are definitely enticing fantasy fights. And it's not clear cut to say who would win, new or old. Unfortunately, we'll never see these fights, but it's fun to imagine. There are other variables to think of too. What if these old fighters came up in the modern MMA scene with the latest knowledge of training science, fitness, and nutrition? It would definitely make a big difference. Now, there's an argument to be made that these legends are only legends because they were exceptions, far above the rest of the competition, and that the average fighter then is below the average fighter today. Not to take anything away from these legends, but this is probably true. Before the time of super gyms and before anyone knew in the West what Sambo was, there was a pretty big skill disparity between the best of the best and the rest. Especially in the 2000s pre-USADA era, there were lots of fighters who relied on special ingredients and sheer size to succeed in the octagon rather than technique. While this worked for some fighters, those with proper skill tended to come out on top. The perfect example of this is Fedor, who went undefeated for over 30 fights against roided up giants while rocking a dad bod. That's no longer the case today, and most divisions run deep. If you need a good example, take a look at the lightweight division as it stands today. The average MMA fighter today is definitely a much more well-rounded fighter than a fighter from even just 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean those exceptional fighters of old aren't. It's very possible they were ahead of their time, and many of them seem like it. After all, many of them didn't retire until recently, not because they lacked the skills, but because time takes us all. And it wouldn't be a stretch to say that if they were taken from their prime and brought to today to face current champs, that they'd give them a run for their money. At the end of the day, everything we talked about is all just speculation, and unfortunately, we'll only ever see these fights in our imaginations or in an EA game. This is just one take on what is and always will be a largely debated and argued topic in MMA. And 10 years from now, we'll be having this exact conversation about what we consider modern fighters now. Let us know what your thoughts are in the comments below. We would love to hear what you have to say about this topic. We wanted to quickly announce our new Patreon page. If you enjoy our content and would like to support our channel, the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching our video. If you haven't, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to check out our Discord channel, and the link will be in the description below.